Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Breaking the Silence, a podcast where we talk about mental health, talk about counseling, talk about advocacy, and offering a solution. My name is Allen Kharlip. I am the clinical supervisor of Addiction Rehab Toronto, and I'm very, very honored and graciously present to have my friend Orli Paling on the show today as a guest. Orli, thank you so much for joining me today.
An absolute pleasure to be here.
So, I talked to a lot of professionals, a lot of people with lived experience, just a wide variety of different people, right? And I think what really draws me to you, and obviously, we have a relationship from the past, but what really draws me to you and why I'm so happy to have you on this show today is, you talk a lot about, the philosophy of counseling, but you're really enamored with people's stories. I remember you saying that to me, and I remember that's a big thing that you sort of communicate, out on a platform like that. But for you and your own sort of personal experience and what you've sort of been able to learn and grow and prosper as your career kind of went along, what got you to go down this route of being a counselor and a therapist, and how that sort of enmeshed into your day-to-day life today? What sort of got you on that path?
That's such a big question. I think my mom would say that she always knew that I'd end up here, which I always think is interesting because I didn't know I'd end up here until I was close to the end of undergrad. But I have, as you said, I've always been fascinated by people's stories. I like to know about their experiences. I have been an observer and analyst of behavior for as long as I can remember. I can't remember a time where I didn't think of someone's behavior as being indicative of something else or coming from somewhere. I don't believe anything is random or spontaneous. I think that it comes from somewhere. So I say to my clients all the time, when we're exploring different things, addiction isn't random. It doesn't just develop out of nowhere. And I'm always interested in an origin story. Where does it come from? When were the seeds planted? I think back, and I've told the story to other people, when I was 18, I was preparing for a gap year. This was before the days of Kindles and Kobo e-readers. And I was a reader, and I think I had watched an episode of Oprah where she had James Fry on talking about his book, A Million Little Pieces. And it was about his story of addiction and finding his way into recovery. We later found out that a lot of the parts of the story were embellished and amplified and things like that. But I was really I was well, I got to read that story. I want to know that story. So I went to Chapters before it was Indigo, and I found that. And then in the same section, I found probably a dozen other biographies or memoirs, and all of them about mental health and addiction. And I took probably a dozen books with me on this trip, and read all of them. And all of them were nonfiction. And since then, I say to people, I'm not really one for fiction. We can make up a lot of stuff. We don't have to. Real life stories are far more interesting than what we can fabricate. So I tend to gravitate towards all of that. And I think that kind of begun my journey into understanding people's stories and what gets them to where they are, and learning about all the different things that people can experience that lead them down that road.
Wow. Amazing. And when you sort of got into this, did you have any sort of ties or familiarity or, sort of maybe not personal experience for yourself, but anybody around you that struggled or suffered from addiction that, kind of giving you that enamored sort of feeling to just, this is something I want to do just because it has affected me so dearly?
So at the time, at that age, I would say not exactly, but what I would say is I grew up in Vancouver, and for anyone who's not from Vancouver, you may have heard about one of our most well-known areas, which is called the Downtown Eastside. And the Downtown Eastside is famous for being the most impoverished postal code in the country, which always seems really strange because Vancouver is also synonymous with like one of the most desirable places on the planet to live year over year. That's how it's ranked. And the Downtown Eastside is kind of like the deep, dark underbelly of the city, only it's like not a secret. It is within blocks of the most expensive penthouses in the city.
Yeah.
So like one of my childhood memories is like my parents, who didn't have a lot of money when we were growing up, if they were going to take us out for dinner, would take us to a restaurant called the Old Spaghetti Factory, which in Vancouver is located in Gastown. And to get to Gastown, you have to drive through the Downtown East Side. And so one of the things that my dad was always really committed to is like when we'd have food left over from dinner, we would pack it up and on our way home would drop it off to anybody that was like living on the street. So that was kind of like early exposure. By the time I was, so I told that story of like getting books when I was like 18. By the time I was 20, my uncle had been working as the resident physician for the Portland Hotel Society in the Downtown East Side. And he had been working at that time for, I'm going to guess probably around 10 years. I don't know exactly what the timeline is. And he had been writing his book on addiction in the realm of hungry ghosts. Many people know of him. His name is Dr. Gabor Mate. I was really interested in reading his book, and because at that point I already had an interest, but I was still an undergrad. And I was going away again for a year abroad, and I was going to be away when the book was published. So he graciously gave me a copy of the manuscript that I could read before it actually came out. And so I read that when I was 20. And what I share with a lot of people is that like that shaped my perspective on working with people struggling with addiction before I even started, and without even realizing that that's what it was doing. Like that was the foundation for my knowledge and my understanding and my outlook. And then I came back from my year abroad. I finished my undergrad in psychology. I almost immediately went into a master's degree in counseling psych. And my first job out of school was running an intensive day treatment program for youth with substance use issues in New Westminster. It was a contract that was funded by one of our local health authorities. And right as I was about to go on maternity leave, after being in that position for about 3 years, I found out that my cousin, who was 18 at the time, was in the grips of a crippling opioid addiction. And so that was sort of the closest addiction had ever hit home for me. But also really shaped the like trajectory of my career up until now, because that was almost that was just about 10 years ago that I found out that he was struggling. And then we had like a really bumpy road, sort of navigating him through, supporting him through detox and like a successful intake into treatment. But nearly 10 years later, he's clean, and like this is the focus of my work.
Wow. How does it feel to be related to Gabor Mate? That's crazy, because I remember when I first heard that, I was like, you're joking, right? Like, you're joking. But no, you're not joking. How like, I mean, you know, not only necessarily, I mean, he you know, his family, but just obviously, you know, maybe getting sort of a more closer sort of exposure to him, and, you know, how he sort of worked and the progression, and sort of how he sort of, you know, educates and teaches and philosophizes, you know, the current sort of content that's out there, and just really, really touching a lot of people and making a huge impact, a lasting impact, right? So how did it feel?
How is it? You know, it's so funny. So many people are like, I get a lot of sort of fangirly reactions when people find out. When I was earlier in my career, I really felt like I wanted to keep my maiden name. My maiden name was Mate. We never used the accent. My dad, who's Gabor's youngest brother, was the only member of their like immediate family that was born in Canada. And my dad just never took on the accent because he was Canadian. Early on, I thought I really wanted to keep my maiden name because I wanted that, I guess, like that proximity, like that, like I wanted people to know. And then what's evolved more organically is that like, it feels really good for people to know me for who I am and not as much for who he is. But then it also gets to be my choice when I share with people that connection. Mm-hmm. and I'm super proud. Like I am, like he is. I mean, he's impacted the world in such a positive way, which like it feels great to be connected to that. He and I have like a really great relationship, and like I'm not quiet about him having been probably the single most influential person in my career as far as like how I work with people and how I conceptualize like addiction and mental health and concurrent disorders and trauma and all of that stuff. And it has given me like such a solid foundation to work from and to learn from. So it's been so helpful and so influential, and he's so supportive of like all of the work that I do. And I think because of the when I talk about sort of like success in my career, I refer more to like the learning how to support people in a helpful way, so that like if total abstinence is their goal, we work with that, and if moderation is their goal, we work with that, and but also helping them just make sense of like why do they engage in those behaviors, and developing more awareness and insight into like how to make changes that really work for them. Like that's what like success is. And I really like attribute so much of that to my outlook on it, like the way I look at it, and the way I look at it is informed by his work. I have said to so many people, like In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts really took off. It was really popular. And so many people have asked, like, why do you think it was such a popular book? And typically what I say is that, like, prior to Hungry Ghosts, the conversation around addiction and the origin of addiction or the causes of addiction was very too simplified. It was an argument of nature versus nurture. And Hungry Ghosts then presented all of this, like, science and research that said it's not an either or, it's both and. It's how, like, it's how your, I will say, it's how your nature is nurtured. It's how your genetics interact with your environment, understanding that our environmental experiences shape our genetic expression. So we can't look at it as one or the other. We have to understand both those things. So when I sit down with people for a session and we're exploring their history, we're talking about family history. We're talking about experiences with their parents. We're talking about relationships with their siblings. We're talking about like trauma and stress that run through the home. And all of that comes together as like different puzzle pieces that then make sense for where they are in their lives today.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love what you said there. The environment shapes the genetics, right? Like, I'm not 100% sure what you said there, but I hope you can tell me after. So I want to keep that in my head. But I mean, that's amazing, right? And I just think, like, you know, being able to be so exposed to, you know, so much content and just how people are, you know, really, really, you know, communicate and develop things. It's just, you know, for you, like, inspiring that capability to be able to really, you know, show people the way or help them identify their own way, you know, through this process that you do with them, right? And I think that's amazing. I think, you know, one of the things too that really stands out about you that, you know, I really enjoy is when you say that you want people to hear, you want to hear people's whole story, not just bits and pieces, right? Because one of the things that we learn about addiction is, you know, we always say, like, do not allow your experiences to shape your narrative. I want to hear the whole story, not just the bits and pieces, right? So, you know, when someone says, well, this is the reason why I'm an addict, or this is why the reason I have concurrent disorders, or this is why, you know, I'm struggling, or this is why I'm depressed, all of these things, right? Like, you know, we really try to break that mantra of, you know, okay, like, experiences happen, but how do we not allow that to typically dominate our life as we sort of move forward into a present experience, right? So is that, like, tell me a little bit about what you mean by whole story.
I think that, like, I mean, guilt and shame keeps people stuck in addiction. Right? Like, what better way to deal with guilt, like those horrible feelings of guilt and shame, than like using, because it gives you just like that little bit of like relief or reprieve from those horrible feelings. But like we have to know the whole story so people understand that, like, you're so much more than just like a list of the harms that you've caused. You know, it is important to acknowledge your behavior. Accountability is huge, but also, like, doesn't it feel better to sort of take accountability for like the terrible things that you've done, and then also like learn how to be accountable for like positive things in your life as well. And also understand that like those terrible things that you've done also came from somewhere, right?
Mhm.
Addiction is it's never the whole story, right? I say to people all the time, I've never in like the duration of my career, which is like, I'm going into, I think like my 13th or 14th year of practice, I've never met anyone who struggles with addiction that didn't have some like pre-existing mental health something, right? I'm not going to sort of slap a label on someone and say, well, okay, well, that's what was there first. But like, whether that's depression, whether that's anxiety, whether it's grief and loss, like OCD, ADHD, like there's so many things that typically predate the experience with addiction. And we have to look at addiction as being like a really effective solution to an existing problem before it becomes a problem of its own, right?
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
reason it becomes its own problem is because your brain is doing exactly what your brain is wired to do. It's
Mhm.
like reinforcing that, like, here's this thing, this action, this behavior that you can engage in that's going to immediately make you feel better, right? And your brain is designed to protect you from pain. So the more you engage in it, the more your brain learns that, like, it's like an algorithm, right? Like, look at the way our algorithms work. The more we engage with content that we enjoy, the more our algorithm feeds us that kind of content. And that's what's happening with those kind of pathways. And the
Mhm.
more we use, the more our brain reinforces that that's the thing that works the best for us.
Mhm.
But then we start engaging with that thing only, and we stop developing other strategies for helping us feel good. So when we talk about the whole story, like, I'm always interested in, like, at what point did you stop developing other strategies? Because that, like, gives us insight into, like, what other tools we need to be developing through your recovery, so that that's not the only thing you have.
Well, I think it's too. It's coming to that realization piece, because a lot of times you don't even realize that. Okay, when did you stop using these effective strategies? When's the
Mm-hmm.
last time you did something that was a healthy strategy? Right. I think in the society that we live in now, more than ever, the idea of like this self-rewarding, quick, instant gratification, exposure is just it's always there. It's always quick,
Constant.
right? And it's really interesting because I had a doctor on my podcast out of California. His name was Dr. Fred Moss. And they used to call him the undoctor. So people would, be prescribed medications and things like that. And what he did was he would or work with somebody and learn effective coping strategies, and learning through like communication to really help
Mm-hmm.
somebody heal, right? And I think nowadays, I mean, I'm sure that you can, sort of comment on this or maybe have your input on this. It just seems like everybody that comes in or has some sort of issue, it's like they're on medication, take this, take that, here's this, here's that, right? And there's no solution. Again, when did you stop learning healthy coping strategies, or when did you stop doing that? Well, when I got put on this medication. So do you
Yeah.
find that in your practice you're seeing more and more of people sort of leaning into what's being prescribed to them because someone's saying, hey, this is what you need to do, this is what's going to instantaneously fix this, without actually really working on yourself to get to that place where you can do it sort of organically?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not like an either or kind of person. Like, I think that for a lot of the concurrent issues that, like, my clients deal with, medication is a piece of the solution, but it's only a piece. It's not a standalone,
Yeah.
right? And in part because, like, when we're talking about disorders, like, I'll use OCD for example, like, OCD is something that, like, we can work on a lot of, like, cognitive tools and behavioral tools to, like, help you manage a lot of the distress that comes up with, like, intrusive thoughts, right? Or
Mhm.
cognitive compulsions. And medication is also a helpful part of that, right? So, like, we know that there's like an overactivity going on in your brain. Let's see how we can help, like, how medication can help sort of bring that down a little bit. And then let's also develop tools like around mindfulness, for example, that's going to help you recognize when it's an intrusive thought, not a conscious thought, how to disengage and carry on with the rest of your life. So I think it's like, it's both and. But I also see so much. I mean, one of the challenges we have, I think, in our Canadian healthcare system is that GPs they're the gatekeepers to specialists. We also have, I mean, in BC, we have a huge shortage of GPs. So access to healthcare is, like, really limited and full of all these barriers. But in order to get to a specialist, you need a GP. And what happens is a lot of people are experiencing mental health issues, and the person they go to first is their general practitioner, who doesn't necessarily have, like, a deep knowledge of mental health disorders, who you need to see, what are some strategies for, like, working with that. And therapy is not covered under our, like, under our like provincial healthcare plan.
Mhm.
So you're like, so what are you supposed to do, right? The thing that is covered is seeing a doctor and the medication that's going to be prescribed. And then it's really up to you, if you have the means to afford to see a therapist,
Mhm.
to like start working on those other things,
Mhm. Mhm.
which I think is part of what contributes to, like, we're seeing a trend right now with like the rollout of all these AI programs. We're seeing so many people lean into AI in place of a therapist,
Yeah.
but AI is not a therapist.
No, it's not. Like, yeah, I see it too, and people are just asking for answers, and it's like, okay, how do I solve my drug addiction? And it's like, here are some
Totally.
things to do. But again, I think that there's obviously, some informative information on there, but it's not, you're right, it's not therapy, because therapy is, it takes two people, right? It takes two
A
people
hundred
to,
percent.
it's almost like dancing. Like, you're not gonna, dance by yourself. Like, it
Totally.
takes two to tango, right? And I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think, for some of the things that you sort of like described there, yeah, absolutely. It just feels like there's not enough money maybe being put into, other outlets where people can really, really benefit from, things like therapy and counseling and treatment and all of those things, right? And yeah, it's tough to watch for sure, and it's tough to see. But for what you do for your own career and how you sort of evolved, you know, you have a therapeutic company, OP
I have a
counseling
practice. Yeah.
practice. Yeah, sorry, that's the word I was looking for. Practice. And I remember, it was just you, and then now you have a couple more
Lucky
people on
people.
board. What is it like seeing your practice grow and having some other, like, new clinicians coming in, and being so excited and just new, and just trying to get their feet wet, and sort of being able to sort of oversee and guide them?
It's so fun. Like I love the one-on-one work with clients. Like that's, nothing takes the place of like how rewarding that is. But it's a different type of work to get to sort of like coach and mentor young emerging therapists, like to help them make sense of the clients that they're working with, and like helping them conceptualize how to work with them is like so exciting. And I think also, like, what comes up so often, because the people that I have working underneath me, many of them have started as student interns, so they're doing their clinical practicum hours for their master's degrees. And what tends to be really fun is like sort of really exposing them to what real practice is like, as opposed to what they're told it's going to be like in school, because the real life experience tends to be really different. And I try to be very real with them about like how things are really going to feel in practice, and what kinds of challenges they're going to face, and like how to work through that stuff. So that part is really fun. I think also what I'm learning as a group practice owner is that like we there are more than enough clients to go around for every therapist that exists in this country. And so I'm trying to like coach them all from a place of like the idea of abundance. There's enough for everybody, and to help them sort of figure out like what's the specialized population that you want to work with. Because I know who I like to work with. Like I've known from like the like day one of practice that I wanted to work in addictions. I was drawn to it. I was interested in it. And you asked me at one point, what's it like to sort of be related to Gabor? And he and I went for dinner once when I was like 18. He was working for the Portland Hotel Society. I was interested in addiction, but I didn't know anything about anything at that point, what 18-year-old does. And he said, what do you think it is about you that population is going to connect with? Like, how will you connect with them? And I was so sort of intimidated by the question that I walked away from dinner going like, I will never be able to like work with that population. Because I was also, I think that was also, not to age myself too much, but that was like 20 years ago, when I think, and what still might run rampant through like a lot of different programs or services, is the idea that like you have to be an addict in order to support an addict. And that's really what I thought. I thought like, well, I haven't struggled with addiction. Well, how am I going to help them? And then I had like a really like poignant moment when I was running the youth program, and there was a supervisor in that program. I was not the supervisor. She herself was in like 12-step recovery, but was not that open about it. And we had a kid in the program who straight up asked, I don't remember if she asked me or she asked the supervisor, like, well, are you an addict? And being that I wasn't the supervisor, I deflected the question to the supervisor, kind of like waited to see what she was going to say. And she kept doing the thing that we're often trained to do as therapists, which is to deflect the question back. Why is that important to you? Why do you feel like you need to know that? Which I think is really just like a frustrating way to deal with something. And the more she deflected, the more frustrated this kid became. And then I looked at her and I said, you want to know if I've ever used substances to cope with things that are hard in my life? And she said, yes. I said, I absolutely have. And in that moment, what I realized is like, that's the experience that's relatable, right? Mm-hmm. What was different for me than a lot of people I worked with is that like, I also came from a family though, that like really helped me cultivate healthy coping strategies and like really kept their finger on the pulse in terms of how I was doing and what kind of support I needed. And so often with the clients that I work with, they didn't have those supportive families, or no one was aware that they were struggling, which suggests that there was already a breach of trust, that they couldn't go to their parents and say, I'm having a really hard time and I need help. Yeah. So I'm aware that like I came from privilege as far as like the emotional support that was provided to me. And that's so protective against something like addiction developing. Yeah. But I understand what it's like to need to get away from your own feelings.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how easy it is to go to substances to do that, because I have done that in my life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, and you know, as the practice sort of evolves and addiction and therapeutic sort of effective coping strategies and modalities change and things like that, like, what would you say for you, like in the last maybe couple of years, that you've noticed has been such an effective modality that people are starting to implement or maybe haven't implemented as of yet, that you feel is going to be a very, very effective tool in helping people sort of navigate through sobriety or combat addiction?
Totally. I think that the 4 modules of DBT, I think, are universally helpful and applicable when working with addiction. Those 4 modalities are interpersonal effectiveness. So ultimately, that's like learning how to be in healthy and effective relationships with people. Emotional regulation. So like how to regulate your feelings when you notice yourself feeling like overwhelmed or your feelings are getting too big. Distress tolerance. So like how you manage your experience of stress or distress, and how much you can tolerate, and mindfulness. And I have yet to encounter a person in treatment for addiction who can't benefit from working on those 4 areas.
Wow. Amazing.
So I think like the application of DBT in addiction is huge. Myself, as well as like my 2 licensed associates in my practice, have all done the basic training for EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. EMDR has like the strongest research base as a modality for treating trauma. So I think that's really important as well. And then what I find is really complementary in particular to a 12-step approach to addiction recovery is that cognitive behavioral therapy, because it's really focusing on like behavioral modification, which works really well with like the steps and principles of 12-step.
Yeah. I mean, it's always been a big proponent for me, where it's like, you know, I got to do it before I start to feel and you know, and see it happen.
Totally.
Right. So cool. And last question for you. What keeps you sort of rolling and going on this path? Like, you know, because I know a lot of people and people tend to sort of burn out, and, you know, they do this for quite a while. And I know in my experience too, being a counselor and sort of how I've changed roles, and I don't do as much as I used to with that, but, you know, I feel myself at times, you know, burning out or like, how long can I, you know, continue to do this? But and I mean, I do things to get myself sort of back into that idea and that sort of paradigm of like, I love doing this, right? But for you, like, what's kind of kept you sort of rolling and evolving? Like you said, 14 years almost, right? That's huge. Yeah. And what keeps you sort of, you know, on that same path? Like when you wake up and you say like, gosh, I know I'm really making a difference here, but what else?
I think I keep my hands in a lot of different things. So like I do the one-on-one work, and I do the student supervision, and I do the coaching with my associates. And right now I'm really focused on a lot of more of like the business management part of my practice, and like how I'm increasing visibility for the practice. And then the other thing is that like I notice about myself that anytime I attend like a conference, it like re-energizes me, because now I've like gone and I've done some learning, and I've like learned new things that I want to take back to my clients. So last year, about exactly a year ago, I went down to Anaheim, California with a friend of mine who's also a therapist, and we attended the Innovations in Psychotherapy conference. And so there were all these workshops with all these like different like top tier clinicians in the field. So I attended like a grief and loss workshop with David Kessler, and like he's the guy on grief and loss. And I attended an attachment-based EMDR workshop with Laurel Parnell, and that's like really her thing. My uncle Gabor was a keynote speaker, and I like attended his workshop. So doing things like that keeps my energy up for what I'm doing, because it helps me to kind of like grow and shift and like, you know, keep things fresh kind of, because it can get, it's not that the work gets stale, but you tend to look for something a bit newer. I mean, like one of the things I talk about all the time with ADHD is like novelty is so exciting. Novelty is like drives you, right? Novelty is like what moves us on to the next thing. And so like going to those conferences or like doing workshops, engaging in something new is exciting, gives me that like dopamine boost that I'm looking for, which like carries me on to the next thing.
Amazing. If you can leave one message to maybe anybody that's listening or is going to be listening to this podcast that we're going to put up at some point in the very near future, what would you say to them? If it's anybody that's struggling, a parent, a loved one, anybody that sort of has felt like they've been impacted by addiction, by concurrent disorder, by mental health, just by society in general, and feeling like maybe they don't have the fight left in them anymore, what would you say to them?
There's a lot of discouraging information out there about addiction recovery, and you don't have to look very far to see statistics about like overdoses and like, you know, these like single digit percentages around like but people staying clean after treatment and things like that. But there's so many more stories of success. So yeah, like there's always going to be like those headlines that are going to feel really discouraging. But like, if you're looking for stories of success, like take yourself to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting and watch people celebrate the clean time that they collect, right? Like you don't have to, you can choose where you put your attention, and hope is so much more encouraging than fear. So like look for stories of hope, look for stories of success, and celebrate them and focus on those, because that's what will keep you going.
Amazing, amazing. Here with Orli Paling, founder of OP Counseling, mental health advocate, amazing counselor, and is really helping and changing people's lives, not just her clients, but also the people that she manages. Thank you so much for joining me today. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amazing.